Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Today we are presenting to you a special program marking the bicentennial birth anniversary of Karl Marx, one of the world's most well-known philosophers who made almost a greater impact than any of his peers if you look at the history. But the world has changed much. How relevant are his theories? It is not a political debate, but rather an intellectual topic.
Karl Marx is often described as one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. Born in 1818, Marx was 30 when he, along with his benefactor Friedrich Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto. Marx believed that capitalism, which was in its infancy at the time, had serious flaws. He claimed that in pursuit of production surplus or profit, capitalists would encourage their ideology that embraces mass production and exploits the working class. Class conflict then arises due to contradictions between the oppressed working class and the capitalists. It would lead to a proletarian revolution that would result in socialism, and eventually lead to a communist society, a classless and stateless society where wealth is distributed evenly, property is owned publicly, and education is free for all. Marx died in 1883 and did not live to see his ideas flourish. Starting from the 1917 October Revolution in Russia, communism became a global movement that has since diversified into the many forms we see today.
So what time did Karl Marx come from? How did he reach his conclusions about capitalism and other important concepts? How did different parts of the world embrace his thoughts? Joining us in the first section of our discussion, we have Associate Professor Dipanka Basu coming from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Welcome, sir. And also joining us in the studio, Associate Professor Kristen Wu from Ghent University from Belgium. How did it start? What about his time that made him who he is as we remembered him?
Karl Marx was a student in the University of Berlin, where he got influenced by ideas, radical ideas of the philosopher Hegel. And he was part of a group who was critical of Hegel, trying to understand the world in a materialist way. And that is the birth of Karl Marx as the thinker.
Well, capitalism, that's always the key word in his works. But eventually, as capitalism evolved over the past 200 years, shall we say, and is still continuing, do you think his theory really worked?
Well, he predicted a lot of things.
Like what?
Such, for example, the globalization of capitalism. So when Marx was a young man and developed his theories, capitalism was confined to England, not even Great Britain, but England, Belgium,
yes,
and parts of northern France and Westphalia in Germany. And he saw, by studying the logics of capitalism, he saw or concluded that it will spread over the whole world. For example, and this is something which has become obviously true today.
Not only capitalism, but also many of the things related to capitalism. Remember, Karl Marx in his works talk about crisis.
Yes,
crisis
indeed.
is another key word related to capitalism throughout his works. So it seemed that worked, quote unquote. I remember the latest column on New York Times is about, you're right,
Yes.
Marx.
Indeed, yes.
All about the capitalism and crisis. So, Mr. Basu, is he right?
One of the main conclusions that Marx drew our attention to was that capitalism as a system is always crisis-born. It never is free of crisis. If we look at the history of capitalism over the past 200 years, it has been absolutely true. 1830s, 1870s, 1930s, 1970, and then we are living through a crisis in 2008.
Right.
So his understanding of capitalism is precisely on the dot in terms of the crisis tendencies of capitalism.
Mr. Marx probably could never have imagined that his theory probably is arguably having a bigger impact than any other philosopher in the world history, if you look at what we have gone through the Cold War and the recent development. But let me ask you, how different countries, different cultures embrace or take advantage or make use of his theories, how it has been different in different, how shall I say, locations and in different rhetorics?
Well, with the spread or with the globalization of the capitalist social formation or the capitalistic of capitalism, also we saw a globalization of the related problems that accompany it. The emergence of a proletariat, of a proletarian class, impoverishment, social problems, and so on and so forth. And for this reason, Marx, as a most profound critic and analyzer of the system, had an appeal for many intellectuals.
So remember, he was not the favorite during his time.
There were 11 people coming to his funeral.
There we go. You see the impact he made at the time of his own.
Exactly.
And yet his theory spread around. You look at European countries. You also look at even here in Asia, Japan, China. How do you see that part of his theory being differently taken advantage of, being made use of in different cultures? Briefly, I understand you have a lot of research about Japan and also briefly about China as well.
Yeah. So the Communist Manifesto is translated in, if I'm not mistaken, 1906, yes. First in Japan. And ever since we see, for example, and we see ever since then in the 1920s a very strong intellectual movement in Japan, which is then suppressed, of course, during the times of war and the interwar period. But after the war, again, it lives
right.
up. We see a reorganization of the left wing. We see a strong student movement emerging. It is becoming the leading Marxism, the leading ideology or historical materialism in historiography and so on and so forth.
But the question even more fascinating than when it was popular in what country is why? Why these countries at these times began to be so interested in Marx theories and believe that could be the way forward? I think that is the ultimate question, isn't it?
Yes. So I can speak for India. So India grew out of an anti-colonial movement. During that anti-colonial movement, the Marxist framework provided answers to many questions of poverty, of development, of exploitation. That is why a large body of people in India embraced Marxism. That is why it became popular.
When is the time that you're talking about?
1930s, 1940s, 1950s.
Very interesting. But you see also cultures, countries, nation states make use of Marx theories, but at the same time forget about it.
That's
from
true.
one time to another. You see Marx theories are being mentioned repeatedly at the time of crisis. And yet his theories are not necessarily the favorite of everyone in the world when the crises are not happening. Is this the general rule of how we see philosophy and philosophers? Or his theory alone is quite unique? Very briefly.
He is providing us with very powerful...
You're having a big smile on your face. I know philosophists think differently from us, but go ahead.
So he's providing us with very powerful tools to understand such crises. And I can tell you my students, which I have now, which are in the first year, they have become conscious, politically conscious in 1908. Now they are 18.
Right.
They have never experienced capitalism as something that is without problems. They only have experienced it as something that is in a crisis.
I see.
And so we see a resurgent interest in Marx.
You see young people, particularly as you just mentioned, are extremely interested from time to time about Marx theories. You see that in the 1960s and 70s with the leftist movement going on inside the United States, for example. You also see China's Communist Party, when it started, very young people. That they are fascinated by this theory of Karl Marx, and they develop something of their own for the future. So how do you see this combination? Different times, young people, and different cultures at different historical stages.
So one of the key insights of Marx was that he could look at the system critically and visualize something beyond capitalism. Young people always want change. When they see oppression, when they see poverty, they want to change the system. And Karl Marx provides a framework to think about that social change. That is why whenever the system gets into a crisis, the whole system there is a question on the whole system, and people start visualizing alternatives to the existing system. And that is when young people and the ideas of Karl Marx come together.
Very interesting, as Mr. Plato said earlier, that philosopher is always beginning with wonder. And wonder is the feeling of philosophers. I guess that's why we are beginning by talking about where Karl Marx came from and how is he likely to have an impact on all of us for the future. Thank you so much for being with us, the two of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Basu and Mr. Wu. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And you're watching World Insight special program marking the bicentennial celebration of Karl Marx's birthday. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching a special program of World Insight marking the 200th anniversary of the birthday of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in the middle of the 19th century, came up with his revolutionary theory about how capitalism works and what the future would be like after it. But how relevant are his theories today? Joining us, we have there two very strong professors in this field. The Professor Wang Hui, coming from Tsinghua University. He's actually recently organizing this discussion session in Tsinghua with the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Studies of Humanities and Social Sciences about Karl Marx.
Yes.
Welcome to our program. Together with him working on that project, Associate Professor Viren Murthy, I hope I pronounced your name right, Professor, at University of Wisconsin-Madison, also joining us here in the Beijing studio. Welcome to both of you. I want to ask about that. Is this still relevant? After all, more than 200 years.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. The world has changed. Professor?
Well, I think I would say that he is very relevant. But there are a couple of things we need to keep in mind, because there is, since say 1989, the fall of the communists, and so on, there has been a tendency to sort of say, no, Marxism, we tried that, but it's finished. But I think that what makes it relevant is that the problems of capitalism have actually become worse, and I think Marxism and Marxist texts are one of the places we can go to understand the logic of capitalism and try to understand how to imagine a world beyond it.
Mr. Marx is not the only one, if I remember right, with my very limited knowledge of philosophy, though, is not the only one talk about the problem of capitalism. In fact, a lot of people talk about the problem of capitalism. So why are we going back to his works these days, Professor Wang? So much interest these days. You see, both East and West about his works once again.
I think that, first of all, is the strength of theory that give at that time, the most profound the analysis about the crisis of capitalism and the capitalism in crisis, and to see that how that the crisis happened again and again.
Right. Why, according to him, if you could explain?
At the same time, his analysis is not, on the one hand, he's like a scientist to give analysis about capitalism, but on the other hand, he's an activist, a revolutionary. So he's not only his own as an individual theorist, but also the organizer and the political spiritual leader for the social movements and the social revolution. So that idea from there, that the different kind of the efforts for change the capitalism was still developed. That's why he's a living tradition. So when we talk about Marx, it's not only about the individual. Of course, he's a great thinker, but also the living tradition. Is a symbolic figure of the whole socialist tradition, I think.
Before we go to the socialist tradition, let me focus a little bit about some of the key words in his theories. One is about technology.
Yes.
The advancement of technology is always related to the development of capitalism, which eventually would always cause or lead to crisis from time to time. How should we understand, Professor Wang, for example, the latest development of technologies? I mean, during his time, his first industrial revolution. Now we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution with artificial intelligence, robots and everything. Even human beings likely to be replaced to a big extent.
Sure.
So, Professor Wang, is his theory still relevant with us? I mean, we are talking about very different stages of technologies.
First of all, the Marx in his days, he was the figure who was invest so much energy to study the natural science and the technology, and that he tried to integrate the analysis about technology innovation together with the analysis of a capital. So that's, I think, he's the figure to do that. That
match is very unique
provided the certain kind of foundation for us to think about these issues. But of course, as you said, that now there's so much development. So the Marxism or the Marx tradition was not a dogmatic the issue. I think we are not treated the Marx and his theory as a dogmatic. It's a real living tradition. We try to learn some inspiration for our own understanding or the interpretation about the new development here. So in that sense, we are not only goes back to the text reading of that Marx, but also try to got some inspiration from his theory and then study the new developments in our society.
Is Professor Wang having wishful thinking that Mr. Karl Marx 200 years ago could still help us to find out what is going on right now with the latest round of technologies, Mr. Murphy?
Well, I think it's very interesting that you mentioned technology, because that is, I think, at the center of a key concept of Marx, namely the concept of relative surplus value. And in that, he was talking about how, as capitalism develops, it tries to increase productivity. So although we're still talking about 1 hour is always 60 minutes, but how much you can produce in that hour becomes much, much greater. Yeah. And with that, what happens is the possibility of using all that technology for communal goods or for something that the society can control. But in capitalist society itself, what happens is that you get increased unemployment. That technology actually doesn't liberate us all the time. It might liberate a few, but I think what Marx envisioned was a way in which we could bring a lot of this science and technology under collective control, and that would be a possibility. So in some sense, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, as long as society remains capitalist, technology is going to cause us increasing problems. However, it also might open the way for a different type of society.
Right. And capitalism could also be the engine that would encourage, according to him, or theories related to his, about encouraging technological advancement.
It definitely encourages technological advancement, but the problem is that technological advancement may not benefit everyone. In fact, it's going to cause all kinds of problems.
It's social impact. That's what we are talking about, right, Professor Wang? Right. The other thing that he has been talking about, which is not really related to what is going on now, is the international system that we have today. At his time, the early time of the Industrial Revolution, every country, nation state is within its own little framework trying to develop on its own. But now we are having international system, particularly after the Second World War. The United Nations, for example, the WTO, for example, institutions like IMF, World Bank. You also got regional thing, APEC, G20 things going on all at the same time. So Professor Wang, I mean, Mr. Marx has never seen a world like this. So his theory of, which is still based on countries, will that work today?
Now his theory is not completely based on the countries. It's really for the talk about the internationalism, international movement, international solidarity among the workers, oppressed people, that how they can organize themselves. So in that sense, if we, of course, the UN or other international institutions was fit to the contemporary capitalism, we talk about the global capitalism, but on the other hand, we can also see that from 19th century, 20th century, a lot of the new developments absorbed a lot of the thinking from Marx and the whole that socialist tradition.
We see globalization. We also see quote-unquote deglobalization these days with, for example, the President of the United States being elected, this process, and also some of the remarks he made about international system. So are we going back to, let's just say, even Marx's time, about nation states once again, bilateral only? Is his theory, in that sense, going to prove the most efficient and the most effective?
Well, I think here we should begin to think about Marx in a broader context and think about also the developments in Marxism. Because there's one concept that I think Marx may have, pointed the way to, but perhaps not develop it completely, which is the concept of imperialism, which emerges with Lenin and others, right? And so this is where you then talk about the international system, but in ways in which are very unequal. But the thing is, this also allows us to see that globalization never meant the end of the nation state, because imperialism was always using the nation state. Capitalism uses the nation state to expand. It cannot expand without the nation state. It actually needs all things like laws and so on. And that's another way in which Marx continues to be relevant today. In fact, the more we have globalization, the more he becomes relevant. And I think that I think is something.
But we also have deglobalization these
yes,
days.
But
therefore, that is the question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The deglobalization is very interesting because it's also because we see that happening everywhere. But we see that also happening on the right and the left, which shows us also
for different reasons.
Exactly. But well, the different reasons, but they're connected. Because what's happening is that people are getting to be upset with capitalism. Otherwise, we have to say, how could Trump get elected? Why is there this populism everywhere? It's because people are getting upset or fed up with the mainstream that is constantly reproducing inequalities and all kinds of other issues.
But one question has to be raised, just follow up what you have just said. Is people fed up with capitalism, or is people fed up with the so-called political apparatus in those countries which practiced capitalism? That's two different things. For example, in the United States, the complaint is, as both of you may know very well, the slow and non-action of the parliament, and also of the struggle within the different branches of the government. So that's his question, rather than the capitalism itself, or is it?
I think two cannot be separated. Because if you think about a lot of the people who are putting their hopes in Trump and so on, think about a lot of his policies, moving away from China and so on. It's to bring the jobs back to the people, right? That's very clearly capitalism, but it's working at a very incomplete understanding of capitalism, which is why his policies are not working, right? So he's not actually able to do that.
One could almost tell your political tendency toward President Trump in your answer. But let me come back to you, Professor Wang. You are understanding deglobalization, that trend apparently is going on. How should we understand that with what Mr. Marx was talking about in his works?
Of course, that's the situation is very different now. But you can perceive that the revival of the interest on the socialism, for example, even in like Britain, that Corbyn, Bernie Sanders in Africa, that's quite a mainstream. That suddenly means that that tradition attracted the people to, not because of the Karl Marx, his own, but because the real crisis. They thought that we need to rethink alternatively, not following the new liberal thinking to deal with these kind of issues. In any case, it's not simply, say, the treat Marx as a dogma for us, but try to learn something from him and for our own struggle.
That is very interesting. And another thing related to this is imperialism, the word you just used, and also hegemony. In a general sense, the word being used. I understand from you, Professor Wang, hegemony actually is a place that is being understood differently in different cultures. It could be a philosophical term. It could also be a political term. So Professor Wang, here's the thing. We talk about global north, global south.
Yes.
Let's just look at the U.S.-China thing as an example. China believes developing countries, emerging economies should have its equal opportunity for development, just as the developed economies used to enjoy. And by the way, according to Karl Marx, the developed economies were really exploiting the labors of the developing countries in order to have so-called surplus value, if I remember right. So Professor Wang, how do you see that, the issue of global north and south, the equal development opportunity vis-a-vis, the Karl Marx theories about capitalism?
That's a lot of the different analysis about that. A lot of the analysis in that time, maybe now the political economists are not really agree on every aspect with Karl Marx analysis about that.
What about yours?
But generally speaking, that the uneven or the unequal relations in this world was still there. So the developing countries were not really in a good position. So in that sense, was still the certain kind of the idea. If you visit Africa or the Latin America or those countries, obviously they thought that they need the certain kind of the power in the global affairs and also have the right for their own developments. That's the change the global structure for the redistribution. That's still the big issue, I think.
It is a big issue, Mr. Murphy, and therefore I want to go to you about that. There's always the debate about hegemony between the East and the West, between the North and the South. And particularly in recent years, when, once again, looking at the United States, when the system, international system, even established mainly by the United States and its allies after the Second World War, once it is not to the best interest of the latter, they wanted to change. And yet, the developing countries, emerging economies are saying, wait, you let us to come into the system. And you say this is going to be the system that's going to benefit all. And you show to us that's how it's benefiting yours. But now you want to withdraw and say, let's just destroy the system. Why do you do that? That is not fair. So here's the thing, once again, going back to our theory discussion. It sounds abstract, but it's not. It is actually going on every day.
Absolutely.
Mr. Murphy.
I think the serious issue to think about here, and this may not directly address what you were saying, but is to think about the system itself as an unequal system, right? And so that from the very beginning, the system tries to pretend that it's equal, but it's actually always sort of, in some sense,
but here is
benefiting
the
one
thing,
person.
what is the alternative? Is the alternative less equal, or is the alternative more equal?
Yes.
Is there a alternative?
So
That is the question.
The alternative is definitely
Professor
more
Wang,
equal.
come in later.
It's more equal, but we have to realize that more equal is not going to be very easily attainable in this system. So this is where, in the earlier question, when we were talking about development and the developing countries, what's very interesting is to try to think the relationship between development and capitalism. Is it possible to have non-capitalist development?
Yes.
And if that's possible, then with the developing countries at one point, I mean, when you had this idea of third worldism and so on, there was the possibility of an alternative. That was really the attempt to find another alternative of development, which then would perhaps in the future, the idea is to create a new system. Because socialism cannot just exist in one country. It has to transform the whole global system. So it's always a global movement. So what we see here are the contradictions within the capitalist world system, which is always going to be unequal. That's part of the system. So this is the way in which we have to think capitalism always exists with imperialism and inequality.
Yeah, but at the same time, it seems, Professor Wang, within the system you say, for example, nation state, a capitalist country, there is unequal opportunity, the issue of that.
Right.
But on a larger scale, there's probably even more between countries. That is the question, isn't it? At least now for the Global South.
Yeah, because you look at, we put this issue from the long historical transformation, meaning that if you look at what happened in the 19th century and the early 20th century, most of the nations were oppressed their colonies and so on and so forth, that the imperial center can easily take out the resources from this area, can exploit those cheap labors from those countries. So the 19th century, 20th century, you perceived a lot of the national liberation movements, social movements, workers' movement, peasants' movement in everywhere.
Right.
So that at least from now we can recognize certain kind of achievements from that the social movements made China, for example, a much strong position in the global affairs. So you can bargaining, you can negotiate with America or other countries. So now they made that, before that the people will argue that the UN, for example, were only the tools for them. But now certain kind of platform for those countries. So then they dislike this kind of platform. They even want to change the whole game. So that's you can see that the social change was really inspired by not only Marx, but the whole living socialist tradition.
I see. Very fascinating discussion, but I have to wrap it up for this second part of our discussion. You're watching a special program of World Insight with Tian Wei, focusing on the 200th anniversary of the birthday of Karl Marx and the impact of this series, relevancy of this series today. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. China is celebrating the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birthday this week. His ideas fueled socialism, something the country was founded on with Chinese characteristics. So how is that related to Marx theories? What inspirations can China still get today from those ideas coming from Karl Marx? Joining us once again, we have Professor Wang Hui from Tsinghua University. Welcome back, sir. And also, this time for this section, lecturer of the School of Arts Institute of Chicago, Mr. Saul Thomas. Welcome as well. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. You earlier said, Professor Wang, that is an offspring of the theory related to Karl Marx. Really?
Yes, of course, that related to this theory. But it's not only for the theory, but it came, you know, the whole social system now in China, existing in China, was the result of the long transformation and what I call the long Chinese Revolution. So in that revolution was part of the general, the social movements in the globally, and for the Asia or in China with its own characteristics, I think.
And you see socialism is still with China, Mr. Thomas. During the Cold War, and now decades after the Cold War, how do you see the special characteristics, as the Chinese always say, about its social form in a way, society form in a way, and how is that related to what we are talking about today, Karl Marx theories?
Well, there were some differences in the society in China from Karl Marx's society. For example, China was predominantly an agricultural country at the time of the revolution. The revolution took place with the Communist Party organizing rural people for the most part.
Rather than the workers.
Yes, and that had a profound impact on the nature of the society that was constructed. At the same time, there were many of the same problems that Karl Marx had talked about in terms of exploitation and sort of oppression of poor people in general, and also the problem of imperialism that Marx and especially more Marxists afterwards have written at length about. China suffered greatly under foreign imperialism from various powers.
And what about now?
Whether China...
Reform and opening up, that's China is celebrating for the 40th anniversary of it. The question is, that's a very different socialism if you look at the dogma theories of socialism. How do you see that?
There is a lot of debate now on how to consider the situation in China now. So you'll hear different answers from different Marxists.
Or non-Marxists.
Or plenty of non-Marxists as well. There's certainly been a great deal of development in the past 20 years. Wealth has increased. A number of problems have also emerged that weren't here before. For example, the divergence between the wealthiest and the poorest has grown very greatly in China. So this is one aspect of society that we could use Marx to analyze.
Right. One of the things are two concepts. One is the political party.
Yes.
The role of the political party in China's socialism, which China believes is related to the basic theory of Marx. The other thing is about so-called Chinese characteristics. Those are two very interesting concepts related to what China is today. Professor Wang, you've been researching about these concepts. Help us to understand briefly.
It's difficult to
briefly, I know.
But on the other hand, I think the Communist Party, as I said, that there was reshaped in the 20th century for different periods. We know that started from very beginning was 1921, was formally established under the huge influence on the Soviet Union and international communist movements. So that was a small group of intellectuals. And so that later Mao said that it's October Revolution sent us the Marxism. So not directly from Karl Marx, though the translation and introduction of Marx theory happened much earlier. It's before the 1911 revolution, but mainly was after the October Revolution, the Soviet Union established, so the Soviet Revolution. So, but afterwards, as the Saul said that in the peasant revolution and the Long People's War, that the party was transformed again. So it's difficult to define such a political party compared to any other parties, even compared to other communist parties. So it's a very, that's quite a singular in the Chinese history. So I think you cannot find the simple definition of this kind of the party to define the Communist Party in China in that sense.
The other thing, if I could invite your advice too about, is this concept between capitalism and the market.
Yeah.
As we understand from Mr. Marx's theories, these two concepts are somewhat quite related to one another. And yet with China's practice, particularly during reform and opening up, these two could be very different concepts. Professor Wang, how do you see these unique combinations of theories?
I think Karl Marx, he did the analysis about the capitalist market economy to see that we talk about the labor, capital, surplus value, and so on and so forth. That was given the certain kind of historical phenomena in the 19th century Britain, England at that time, with the example for him. But on the other hand, a lot of the historians who influenced by Marx theory, but trying to make some certain kind of distinction between the capitalism and the market. The market economy and the market was different. The market economy more or less equal to the concept of the capitalism, but the market itself as a mechanism, we can find that it existed for quite long history, that you may be traced back to the 1,000 years, but that only in the at least after the England Industrial Revolution, then that transformed gradually to these kind of the stage of the market economy, dominant every social sphere. So that was different from the early market mechanism. Now, how can we, after the socialist revolution, after the transformation in China, how can we use that? Became a big challenge. So that's the why the people rethink about the relationship between not only the capitalism and the market, but also the socialism and the market.
Exactly. Mr. Thomas, your thoughts here?
Well, there have been some changes since the market was introduced, and there have been some trends where the market has come to play a larger and larger role within the society. There are still some areas within China that are sort of protected from the market. For example, the question of land, especially in the rural areas, it's protected from the market. This is one of the legacies of the revolutionary period. I guess this will be the question, is if China is going to maintain these legacies from the socialist period or completely embrace the market completely. And then there will be a question as to how much of a difference there will be between China as a market society or just full capitalism.
China talk about political theories, but our discussion today is totally intellectual discussion. Before we go, I do want to ask you about that. How are we going to see where the future is? How much pragmatism, another big word, is likely to play its role in wherever we are heading for?
Yes, we need to think about that. Now we talk about we need to remember what's the original starting point for us. I think that because that starting point was really started from 19th, 20th century in the real crisis, in the national crisis and the social crisis and so on and so forth.
Right.
So that's the beneficial to everybody, serve to the people. All the people should become the master of our own society, not allow the small group of people dominant everywhere. So that's, I think, that from the beginning. So I think that showed that we need a certain kind of the new model toward that direction was still necessary.
I heard not only pragmatism but also idealism going on over there as
that's
well.
all, yes, of course. It's always related to the ideas. Full the pragmatism.
Yes, okay, there we go. Wang Hui and Saul Thomas, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Wei. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and the world. Good night. Thank you so much.